Life during the era of ancient empires was anything but easy. While there are tales of kings and queens living lives of luxury, common folk toiled to keep the wheels of society turning. In today's video, we'll be exploring the stark contrast between the daily life of a commoner versus nobility in ancient times. The average lifespan of a commoner during the time of ancient Greek empires like Athens or Sparta was around 35 years. This was due to a multitude of factors, including poor nutrition, lack of basic medical understanding, and rampant diseases. Wars also played a significant role in reducing life expectancy, as commoners were often the ones who got thrown into the thick of battle with little armor and training. Life wasn't much better for women in ancient Greece. Even though Greek society is often lauded for its relative gender equality compared to other ancient civilizations, Greek women were still confined to the domestic sphere. For most, their days consisted of managing a household, bearing children, and tending to their family's property. Athenian women could own property and had more freedom of movement than their counterparts in other regions, but they were still expected to be subservient to men. Spartan women were perhaps the most liberated, participating in athletic competitions, and even allowed to own helots as slaves. But outside of Sparta, women were largely denied an education beyond basic literacy, and were discouraged from any intellectual pursuits. Most women in ancient Greece were married by the age of 20, and continued to live under their father's authority, even after marriage, although Spartan women were allowed to remain in their family home until around the age of 30. Daily life for a commoner during the time of ancient Rome was not much different. Life expectancy was similar to that of ancient Greece, hovering around the 30-year mark. Women were largely confined to the domestic sphere and were expected to manage a household and bear children. Roman law did allow for women to own property, but this was more common among upper-class women, as lower-class women were usually too busy trying to secure food and other necessities for their families. Despite the hardships they faced, commoner women in ancient Rome did have access to public baths and could attend gladiator games and chariot races, which were considered appropriate activities for females. Roman women were also more involved in religious life than their Greek counterparts, as they could serve as priestesses and were allowed to participate in public festivals. However, they were still ultimately subservient to male authority, whether it be their father or husband. In contrast to the commoners, members of the nobility during the time of ancient Greece and Rome lived lives of luxury and privilege. They were the wealthiest and most powerful members of society, and their daily lives reflected this status. Let's start with the Greeks first. The average age of a male citizen in ancient Greece was around 40 years old at the time of the Persian and Peloponnesian Wars. This is a few decades higher than the commoners, which speaks volumes about the disparity in living conditions between the classes. In terms of their daily lives, adult male citizens were expected to participate in politics and make decisions about the city-state. However, only a small percentage of men actually held political office, with most serving on juries or as low-level administrators. The vast majority of men spent their days working as merchants, artisans, or landowners. While ancient Greek society did have some full-time soldiers, most able-bodied men were expected to put down their tools, or their oars, and pick up a weapon if the city-state went to war. Noblemen were often exempt from such duties as they could afford to hire mercenaries to fight on their behalf. Ancient Greek nobility also enjoyed a more leisurely lifestyle. They had access to better food, housing, and clothing than the commoners, and had more time to enjoy the arts and culture. Athletic competitions were particularly popular among the nobility, as they had the time and resources to train. In ancient Sparta, however, things were a bit different. Spartan society was heavily militarized, and all able-bodied males were expected to participate in the agoge, a rigorous state-sponsored education and training program designed to turn ordinary citizens into obedient, highly disciplined soldiers. Upon completion of the agoge, young Spartan men would continue to live together in communal barracks, and would remain part of the military until around the age of 60. They took turns cooking meals for one another, and no one was permitted to own any personal belongings. Spartan society was extremely strict, and any form of theft was met with harsh punishment, even if the item stolen was used to pay back a debt. Slaves called helots were forced to do the labor-intensive work for the Spartans. Women in ancient Sparta were also treated differently than in other city-states. As mentioned before, they were allowed to own property and were permitted to compete in athletic competitions. However, Spartan women were also expected to be subservient to men, and were largely denied an education outside of domestic skills. Across the Mediterranean, in ancient Rome, The Roman Empire was built on the backs of commoners, who toiled as farmers, laborers, and soldiers. But at the top of the pyramid were the elites, the Roman nobility, whose lives were vastly different from the commoners they ruled over. During the time of the Roman Republic, the average age of a male Roman citizen was around 45 years old. This was much higher than the commoners' average of 30, reflecting the fact that the ruling class had access to better nutrition, healthcare, and overall living conditions. The Roman nobility was made up of a small group of landowning aristocrats, who controlled the Roman state. They held most of the wealth and power in Roman society, and were able to use their influence to enrich themselves and their families. Roman nobles lived in luxurious villas, wore fine clothing, and ate delicious food. They also had access to the best education, and were well versed in rhetoric, philosophy, and the arts. Members of the Roman nobility were also heavily involved in politics, and held many of the highest offices in the Roman state. They saw these positions as a way to advance their own interests and those of their family, and were willing to use any means necessary to gain power. Roman nobles were known for their lavish spending and extravagant parties. They hosted feasts and banquets in their homes, and competed against one another to see who could throw the most impressive event. These parties were not only a way to show off their wealth, but also an opportunity to network and make valuable connections. Ancient Rome had a hierarchical society with distinct classes. At the bottom were the slaves, who were considered property and had no rights. Above them were the commoners, who were free but had limited rights and were mostly poor. The middle class was made up of merchants, artisans, and small landowners, while the upper class was the ruling elite. Members of the upper class had significant wealth and power and were heavily involved in politics. Ancient Rome also had a system of patron-client relationships that helped to maintain social order. Wealthy nobles were expected to provide for the needs of their clients, who in turn were expected to support them politically. These relationships were mutually beneficial and helped to ensure the stability of Roman society. The Roman Empire was built on the foundation of conquest and expansion, and this required a strong military. Roman soldiers were known for their discipline and effectiveness, and they played a key role in the empire's success. However, being a soldier in the Roman army was not an easy job. Soldiers were often away from home for long periods of time, and they faced dangerous enemies and harsh conditions. Despite the challenges, soldiers were respected members of Roman society and were often given land and property as rewards for their service. As we wrap up our discussion of the differences between the daily lives of a commoner and a member of the nobility in ancient Greece and Rome, it's important to note that these were not static societies. Over time, the roles and responsibilities of each class changed and evolved. Additionally, not every commoner or noble lived the same way. There were variations within each class, depending on factors such as location, occupation, and gender. Despite these changes and variations, the general trend was that the higher up you were on the societal rungs, the more privilege and power you had. Being a member of the nobility in ancient Greece or Rome was undoubtedly a desirable position to be in. They lived lives of luxury and had access to the best that society had to offer. However, it's important to remember that this came at a cost. The responsibilities and expectations placed upon them were high, and they were often expected to put the needs of the state above their own. What did you find most interesting about the daily life of commoners versus nobility in ancient Greece or Rome? Which time period would you rather live in? Comment below. And as always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more content.